Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back here with you. It's only a couple more of these online services. We'll soon be back in person, and we're very excited about it. Thank you, Megan, for leading us in worship. There will be lots more of that to come, especially in person. So this morning we're looking at John chapter 15, verse 12 to 17. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about the way Megan and I started dating. If you're not aware, I am not from here. You may have realized by the weird words that I say sometimes, the weird accent that comes out. Yeah, I was living in London at the time, and Megan was living here. And the time difference is pretty considerable. So half of the year was about 8 hours difference, and the rest of the year was 7 hours difference due to the time change. Thankfully, time doesn't change in Arizona. It's one of the good things. What happened is, in order to keep in touch, I would stay up a large portion of the night. In fact, often I would go to bed really late and then get up early, so I had the opportunity to talk to Megan on the phone. Technology is quite amazing. We would video call and talk for many hours, and that's how we got to know each other. That's one of the advantages of a long-distance relationship, is you really got to communicate. But I feel like I'm still paying the consequences of the lost sleep. I was really excited to learn about this new person, to really bond and connect with her, that I was willing to sacrifice my sleep, willing to sacrifice my time. I was really just focused on aligning my life to spend time getting to know her. Now the question is, it's one thing doing it for romantic purposes, right? People do crazy stuff for romantic purposes, for passion, but the question is, what are we willing to do that for one of my brothers and sisters? And that is a tough question, but I believe that's the kind of sacrifice, that's the kind of level of commitment that we're supposed to have for one another. And today we'll see how today's passage is really calling us to love one another to the point of personal sacrifice. So let's get into the reading. Just for context, we're still in the same spot, if you've been following us every week, where Jesus is talking to his disciples as he's about to be arrested, as he's about to die on the cross for his sheep. At this point, Judas is already left, so he's talking to these close followers, his close disciples, the remaining 11, and he's giving them a bunch of teaching, right? Giving them a bunch of direction and information. And as we know, they will falter as Jesus is arrested and put on trial, and Peter will deny him. But they will look back on this and remember Jesus' teaching and know what it means, which is kind of what we're doing today. So as I said, we're reading from chapter 15, verses 12 to 17. And it says this: "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from the Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you, so that you will love one another." Love one another to the point of personal sacrifice. Love one another as I have loved you. That's a big statement, right? It could be, I could make the same kind of statement to my daughter, right? Love people like I have loved you. And it's easy because, I'm just human. As much as a father, you're kind of willing to do more than you would for another person. it's still kind of limited in scope. Now, we're talking about the Savior of the world that came and gave up his life. That's what "as I have loved you" really means, right? But where we heard this commandment before, this is not the first time that Jesus gives this commandment, right? We saw it in chapter 13, verse 34. He says, "I have a new commandment for you," right? He says, "I have a new commandment for you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. And by this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." But I just want to point out that this is the thematic point of this paragraph, right? He starts with, "Love one another as I loved you, and I'm telling you these things so you will love one another." It's the thematic tie of this section of what John's recorded for us of Jesus saying. And it's, as I said, it's not just love one another as you see fit. It's not just like friends love one another, like family love one another, kind of on our whims, on our passions, on where our heart is that day, if we're not tired. No, Jesus says, "Love each other as I have loved you." So how did Jesus love his disciples? Well, the most basic thing is he came into the world for the very purpose to save them. That's the only reason why Jesus became incarnate. That's the only reason why his ministry existed and his very life on earth existed. And he looked after them, right? He fed them when there was no food. He even fed 5,000 people. He washed their feet. That's what we saw recently, right? He served them in a humble way. Feet in the Near East at the time, they were dirty. People wore sandals. It was not a nice thing to do. You could wash someone's head. That would be probably less gross. But no, he cared for them. He wanted to teach them that humility, and he served them. And he also healed them. I mean, he raised Lazarus from the dead, right? But generally, he looked after them. And he came into the world, called them to himself, walked with them, knowing that he was going to suffer and die for them. So every step of the way, they had no idea, because he wasn't begrudgingly doing his ministry, right? He knew that he was going to die for them. And yet he was just always perfect, right? Sinless. And through his death, that's how we are able to be saved, right? This was a deliberate choice by Jesus. Jesus chose to come. The Father sent his Son deliberately so that he would die to save us, right? And he wasn't killed because of his disciples. He wasn't killed because they did something and he took the brunt of it. Just kind of happened, right? You know, I'm your leader. I'm going around with you and I'm teaching you some things. And this has led to some conflict. And instead of you dying, I'm going to die. No, this was the choice from the very beginning, before he was even conceived in Mary's womb, right? He didn't find himself in the firing line. This was the deliberate choice to go there, right? And it was also a deliberate choice for him to stay on the cross. There's a quote, I forget the name, but it wasn't nails that kept Jesus on the cross. It was love. My wife and I like to sometimes watch like survival shows, and it always strikes me as really challenging, because the survivalists have to choose to remain there through hardship, because they know they can tap out, right? So the Son of God is on the cross, and he's suffering, and he knows he can call the armies from heaven. He can just step down, right? But he chooses not to, and that's what made me think of this. These survivalists are like maybe having gangrene or some parasite or eat something bad, but they still stick with it. And it's like, it's the same thing. It wasn't accidental that Jesus ended up on the cross. But his love for his people, for his disciples, for sinners, for his friends, for his sheep, that's what kept him on the cross. In John 10, we saw that he says, "I'm the good shepherd." And the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So, what does it mean to love one another as Jesus loved? It means to love one another to the point of personal sacrifice. But let's look at specifically what Jesus said, right? In verse 13, he goes on from saying, love one another as I have loved you. This is my commandment. And then it seems to kind of like switch to greater love has no one than this, that lay down his life for his friends. And I'm thinking from the disciples' perspective that I've not yet witnessed Jesus dying on the cross for them. They're probably like, huh? Like, hold up a second. What's going on here? Right? He's like, love each other as I loved you. And then the greatest sacrifice is to lay down your lives. And it must be a hard thing to hear for the disciples, especially as he just told them, I'm going to leave you, essentially. Of course, he's leaving with them, teaching, he's sending them the Holy Spirit, but they didn't get this at the time. At the time, it must have been really confusing for Jesus to pare down these things together. But specifically looking at laying down your life for your friend. Have you ever been ready to lay down your life for a friend? Have you ever exhibited love like that? See, as a teen, I remember instances where I put myself in harm's way for the sake of a friend. And there's been eerie situations where I've just tried to tactically get us out of the situation, and sometimes it involved a risk for harm. But was I willing to die for them? If it really came to it, would I have just run away? I always had the opportunity to. I'm not sure. I had a friend in college who, Craig, he was out one night with his friends, and he noticed a group of people beating up this guy, and he just walked up to them and told them to stop. And they were like, oh, sure, okay, yeah, no problem, we'll just go away. No. They punched him in the face, and he knocked him to the ground. And he got up again and said, stop hitting him. And he got hit again. He had stitches from this. He was really pretty beaten up badly, but they eventually walked away and left the guy alone. He didn't know the guy. It was just a stranger. And when we think about a story like this, it's like crazy, right? It's not the norm. It's not the norm to put yourselves in harm's way and to that degree for another person. It's crazy, right? But this is what Jesus is calling us to do. This is the kind of devotion to one another that he's calling us to really put our own self-interest, danger, life, health in the harm, in give it up basically for each other. And actually, this idea of giving your life out for your friends makes sense to us as we're looking back, and it probably makes sense to the disciples as they're reflecting on what Jesus said. Hence why John recorded it. John was right there. Probably didn't get it at the time. But as we know what Jesus is about to do, and at this point in time, it makes sense. He laid down his life. He laid down his life. He gave up his life. He set that example. So it wasn't out of context when he's saying, love each other as I loved you, which includes giving your life up for friends. He was about to do it. You know, as Paul said, one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though even a good person, perhaps someone would die for. But God shows that in his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This is the standard. This is the extent to how we are to love each other. It's not loving out of convenience. It's not loving while it's easy. It's not loving with your extra. It's loving when it becomes a cost. Mother Teresa was known to have said, love until it hurts, because real love hurts. It wasn't like some self-harming kind of idea. It wasn't some crazy notion that if it doesn't hurt, you're not really loving. It's your devotion to one another, your love for one another. If it's limited by what something is going to cost you, it's not real love. The widow with the 2 copper coins came to mind, right? Jesus is in Mark. This is in Mark 12. Jesus is watching. He's sitting opposite the treasury, and he's watching people put money in the offering box, right? And there's rich people that just drop stacks of coins, right? Stacks of notes. They probably didn't have notes at the time, but that's the equivalent. Big stacks of dollar bills, $100 bills. But this widow only has 2 coins. And the 2 coins make up a penny, as far as I've understood. And he brings the attention of the disciple to this and says, see, that this widow put in more than all these people, all these other people. Nobody else here put in more than this widow. She put everything that she had, everything that she had to live on. She didn't put out of her abundance. She put out of what she had. And I gotta tell you, I often feel like the rich person. Not because I'm rich, but because I feel like I'm always trying to restrain what I do for others out of energy that I have available. And, like time that I have to spare. Which it's made me think in a way that I don't have any spare time. Because if I say I have spare time, then I'm supposed to give it to someone else. But it's a wrong way to think. Or even worse, maybe we can be like Mr. Bean. When I was a kid, there was this episode of Mr. Bean where this person is going around with a metal can, asking for money. And I didn't get it at the time. I have to ask my dad. But basically what happens is Mr. Bean puts a coin into this slot, but doesn't let it go. And with the other hand, shakes the can. And then slyly pulls the coin away. I didn't get it at the time. As my dad explained to me, what he was trying to do is make it sound like his coin had dropped. He was shaking the coins to make it sound like his coin had dropped into the rest and made a metallic noise, right? So the guy is very confused. But he was trying to, either he felt like he had to, or he felt like he wanted to make it seem like he was giving, but in reality he didn't even give at all. Definitely be careful that you're not like Mr. Bean. And the other thing is, as God sent His Son while we were still sinners, we're also not to judge before we give ourselves to one another. Is this brother or sister, is this friend worthy of my sacrifice? That's not what Jesus is calling us to. It's not a healthy mentality. As I said, Christ died for us while we were still sinners. You see, the point is not, it's not even to bless one another, it's to glorify God, right? When Jesus first gave this commandment, as we've read, He said this, by this love, people will know you're my disciples. For this love, this sacrificial love, He's expanding on the previous notion, right? The sacrifice is for God's glory. If it's a love that everyone else has, if it's a love out of your abundance, if it's a love that doesn't require sacrifice, personal sacrifice, then how would the people know that we're Christian? In fact, people generally know they're Christian because we say it. But Jesus is not saying people will know that you're Christian because you're going to tell them. Jesus said, people will know they're Christian because you have a special love for one another. The world does not have. The world thinks it's crazy. The world thinks it's crazy to put yourself in danger for someone else. They might even put it as heroic so they can dismiss it. But the sacrifice is for God's glory. So when you think about a brother or sister and an opportunity you have to help them that is going to cost you, don't think, is this person, yeah, they're nice, or they did something for me before, or I might need a favor from them. There's no measuring. There's not a political kind of relationship. It's a godly kind of relationship, right? We're all Jesus' disciples, and we're to go by His set example. Love one another to the point of personal sacrifice. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friend. That's what Jesus said, right? So who is Jesus' friend? Who benefits from Jesus' sacrifice? Well, in verse 14, Jesus says, you are my friends, if you follow my commandments. What is this thing? This is a recurring theme, right? You love me if you keep my commandments. You'll bear fruit if you keep my commandments. It seems like legalistic. What is up with that? Well, in the words of one of my favorite professors, John Dulce, living a life of obedience in response to Jesus' love is profoundly different than legalism. He's not saying, do these things to earn my love. Do these things to earn my friendship. It's more of the same sense as we looked at a few weeks ago. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments, right? There is no friendship. Like a good friend doesn't do things against the friendship, right? As I said, it's the same sense of if you love me, you keep my commandments. It's the same thing. Loving my commandments is a demonstration of your love for me. It's a demonstration of your friendship for me. See, it's a matter of evidence, of logical, natural progression. It's like saying it's hot, so I will sweat, right? I don't sweat to earn the heat. I hope no one's doing that here, because it's already too hot. But it's the opposite of a toxic friendship, right? I'm always big, if you talk to me about friendship you're struggling with, I'm always big on calling out toxic friendships, right? Someone says that you're a friend, but doesn't act like a friend, right? They don't have your best interest in mind. They slander you with other people. They take your opportunity to undermine you. They don't rejoice with you. That's not a friendship. That's not a friend, right? And it's the same thing. If you don't obey Jesus' commandments, you're not his friend. Like you can call your friend. You can call yourself a follower of Jesus, but it's a matter of evidence. So when someone comes to me and talks to me about they're struggling with this relationship, I will tell them, this person's not your friend. At that point, you make a choice, right? You make a choice whether you're going to disengage with them or you're going to try to fight that relationship. But it's a matter of evidence, a matter of fact. If you follow Jesus' commandments, it shows it's a natural progression of your friendship. If you're friends with Jesus, you will follow his commandments. It's just how it works. But why is Jesus talking about friendship? It's kind of like, for us, friendship is like a vague thing, right? It's a vague, a laid-back kind of relationship. How do you find friendship? What is an acquaintance? What's a friend? What's a close friend? We don't really have a specific set of parameters. We kind of all know what a friend is, but we don't have a specific set of parameters. However, in the context that Jesus is talking, friendship was a little different. It was more formal. So the same way that you might say you're with someone, dating someone, because you agree, you just have a conversation and say, hey, what are we, right? In the same way, you would say, I want to be your friend. Kind of like a friend request on Facebook, although that's really meaningless. In this case, it was very meaningful. And this is why Jesus is telling them, you are my friends. He's making it official. Not Facebook official, actually official. And there's some significance here, like there's some characteristics of this type of friendship that were understood at the time. Just like we know what friendship means to us today, the disciples would have known in their cultural, historical context what friendship meant. So one important aspect, which shows why Jesus timed it here, is that the bond of friendship was thought to remain even when the friends are separated, right? Jesus is about to leave. He's about to leave them alone. Well, not necessarily alone, right? With the Holy Spirit eventually. But he's about to leave them, and he wants them to know it's not like when a master leaves his slaves, that they are now masterless. No, we are friends, and when I'm gone, we'll still be friends. And then there was other characteristics, like it required openness and honesty. Friendship was other-centered. And I think those two are good standards for today's friendships. If you're struggling with friendship, those are actually good standards for friendship today as well. Other-centered. Focus on the other. And it's a special kind of relationship, right? And it's assisted by a common interest. That's probably the biggest thing today. It's people share interests, and that's why they're friends. But that's important also for us, A common interest can be Jesus. We're followers of Jesus, and therefore we are friends, right? That's why we call each other brothers and sisters. Not because we're born with the same mother, brother from another mother. Literally, Jesus unites us all as brothers and sisters, as friends. It's this official relationship that is different from our other relationships, different from how the world does relationships. Interestingly, the Greek word used here for friendship also means affection. And it means the affection of a friend, right? And I think that's also important when we consider what is God calling us to into loving one another and to bringing the topic of friendship into this conversation. See, Muslims insist that the only proper relationships between humans and God is that of slaves to master. And that makes total sense to me. I mean, if it doesn't make sense to you, you probably need to consider who God is and who you are. You know, we're just sinners and we're worthy of destruction. We definitely don't deserve Jesus' friendships. But Jesus, this is kind of grace, right? That's the amazingness of grace. He's telling us, you're not like servants. Servants just don't know what's going on, right? And that's true in Islam. People don't know. They'll follow the rules set out, but they won't know whether they will go to heaven until they die. They are blind. But that's the opposite of all Jesus' message, right? I am the light. When you walk in the light, you will see where you're going. He calls us friends, and as a result of calling us friends, as a result of being our friend, of wanting to be our friend, of having this particular relationship, he laid down his life for us. So we have the affection of friendship and the selfless, self-giving sacrifice. This is the example that Jesus set for us. And this is what he calls us to do, right? Love one another to the point of personal sacrifice. Not love one another like we see each other on a Sunday and we wait, but actually give of ourselves. Personal sacrifice. The final thing that Jesus says in this passage, verse 16, I'm going to read it again in case you've lost track of it. But it's still within this thematic, right? That it started with love one another as I've loved you. And I'm telling you these things so that you'll love one another. So we still need to take it as a unit. You did not choose me, Jesus says, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. You did not choose me here doesn't mean that the disciples, didn't make a willing decision to follow Jesus when he called them. But it's just, it's just another indication of Jesus' supremacy overall, right? They weren't coerced to follow Jesus. They weren't shackled to Jesus, but Jesus is emphasizing that the ultimate factor in who would follow him was Jesus' own choice. And as he chose us as friends, in dying for us, Jesus took this first step in this friendship. But what I want to highlight here is that Jesus didn't say, I chose you to save you from your sins. That too, of course. But he says, I chose you so that you would bear fruit. I chose you as his people to be fruit-bearing branches, as we saw last week, right? Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. Branches are to bear fruit, and the vine dresser, the Father, will make sure to produce fruit, and more fruit, by pruning them or cut them off, right? We also have to always look in context. Jesus just said this before this section. Be fruitful branches. And now he's saying, I chose you for the purpose of being fruitful branches. Now, what has this got to do with bearing fruit and laying down your life? What has this got to do with laying down your life for your friends? How do the two things match together? What does it have to do with loving one another to the point of personal sacrifice? Well, if you remember, in chapter 12, we saw that Jesus said this, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. This is the connection between bearing fruit and personal sacrifice. You see, we can aspire to give up our physical life, our earthly bodies for the sake of brothers and sisters. We can aspire to be like Craig, just off on a whim, step in when someone's being beaten and not resort to violence, but just literally physically putting ourselves there. We can prepare mentally. We can even think daily. I'm going to do it. If the time comes, if the opportunity comes, I will do it. Kind of like we might think patriotically, right? If war comes, I'll take the risk upon myself, pick up my gun and fight. Or if an oppressive government forms, I will put my life in danger and fight for freedom. Or, in a less grandiose way, in a less crazy way, if my neighbor's house catches on fire, I will be the one, I think this all the time, by the way, I will be the one to run in and save their baby. Right? It's noble, it's heroic. But it's not just that. You see, the point of loving one another to the point of personal sacrifice is not to glorify ourselves. It's not to earn praise, not to be thought of as heroic, but it's to show that we are friends of Christ, that we are His sheep, and most importantly, the purpose of loving one another to the point of personal sacrifice is to glorify God. Our sacrifice in loving our brothers and sisters is to die to ourselves, to die to our earthly desires, to die to pride for the glory of God. It is easy to display the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control out of your abandons, right? When you're well-rested, when you have time, when you're having a good day, it's easy to have joy, right? But it is hard when it requires sacrifice, when it requires putting others first, when it requires dying to ourselves. And it's that dying to ourselves for our brothers and sisters that brings out that fruit that really glorifies God. You think the world knows you apart from itself as belonging to Christ when you're kind to those that are kind to you? When you're patient with someone that's on time? When you're gentle with someone that is sweet and loving? When I'm gentle to Pia? What about when you sacrifice your time and sleep for a new and exciting relationship? Big whoop. That's usually the reaction I've had when I've complained of how the sleep has affected me. Which is fair, because people do that. It's nothing special. That is not something that makes you stand out as Jesus' followers. So Jesus chose you to die to yourself and produce fruit. He chose you to love one another, not like the world loves, but how He loved, sacrificing yourself for each other, putting each other first. Don't worry, I'm reaching in. In summary, Jesus is calling the disciples, you and me, to love one another just as He loved us. This means laying down your lives, loving to the highest standard. He calls you friends, and so you are to show to have that affection of friends for one another. Friendship, affection, and self-sacrifice. You were not called so that your sins may be forgiven, but you were called to bear fruit. You were called to glorify God. You were called to love one another. The Christian life is not about salvation for ourselves, but sacrifice for others, for the glory of God. That is the central part, and we must never forget this. As Paul encouraged the church in Ephesus, I'm going to tell you, be imitators of God. Walk in love as Christ loved us, and gave Himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. That is what should be your motivator when you're thinking about sacrificing yourself for others, when you're thinking about loving one another to the point of personal cost. Think about how that is an offering to God. That is the example that Jesus set for us. This whole time, He didn't glorify people as He was giving His life. He was saving people for the glory of God. So be imitators of Him. Give yourself up for others. Love one another to the point of personal sacrifice, as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I heard a song last night, kind of coincidentally, and it said this: I found my life when I laid it down. Because that is the identity. If you're called to be one of Christ's followers, that's what gives you identity. that you sacrificed your life for God's sake. Let me close in prayer. Father, I thank you for all the teaching that you have left us in writing that we can meditate on, and the clarity of what you've shared with us so that we can really understand and walk in the light. I pray that you help us in our sinful nature and our shortcomings to really follow your example and love each other, love one another, love our brothers and sisters, not when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. Let us glorify you in that way. Pray that you bless your people today. In Jesus' name.